It's your girl, your host, Jocelyn, y como siempre, I am so grateful you are here and tuning into this very special episode with Vanessa Bennett, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist, author, facilitator, podcaster of the Cheaper Than Therapy podcast, and mama. And I am so excited to just have this conversation with Vanessa. I feel like it's going to be a very insightful conversation surrounding healing and healing in relationship and all of that good stuff. So Vanessa, thank you so much for being here.
So excited to have this conversation. I appreciate you bringing me on.
Of course. So we start all of these conversations with gratitude, and I'd love for you to share with us what it is that you currently feel grateful for.
Yeah, I love that you said, think about it a little bit, right? Like you prompted me before you come on, have a thought. And I really did. I sat with it for a few minutes and I think the kind of typical things came up like, oh, I'm grateful for my health. I'm grateful that I have a healthy kiddo, all these things. And then I thought, no, what I actually feel the most grateful for right now is that I live in a moment in history where things are shifting and changing and being questioned. And it's terrifying, but there's also a lot of excitement in that. And I actually do feel gratitude for it. I mean, I could say that I'm scared of all the things that aren't good, right? But I actually find that it's more resonant for me right now to say I'm grateful that we're in this moment where we can make changes and it's happening.
I love that. And I feel like what you shared, that what came up for me is like, it really is all about perspective. So I love that. And I would ask you to dive in a bit more on that because it piqued my curiosity, but there's a lot of good stuff I want to get into here with you. You completed your master's in counseling psychology with an emphasis in depth psychology at Pacifica Graduate Institute. And I'm just curious what it means to be a depth psychotherapist.
Yeah. So depth psychotherapy, analytical psychotherapy, these are all kind of houses of psychology that live under Jungian psychology. So it really is the practice of Jungian psychology. It's a practice of investigating, understanding, and really working through the way that Carl Jung practiced his psychology. So what does that mean? Depth psychology really is not necessarily as interested on like what's going on the surface as we are what's going on in the unconscious, right? I mean, we know that about 97% of our daily functioning is unconscious, right? We think we're calling the shots, but we're not. And so a Jungian approach or a depth approach really looks at the language of the unconscious, the language of the soul, if you will. So dreams, metaphor, image, right? The unconscious does not speak in what we speak in. It's not a language oriented, section of ourselves. And so we're much more interested in going deeper, right? Even what one might say on the surface is a symptom. Depth psychology would say, well, what is the symptom serving? Like what's going on beneath the symptom, right? And so, one might say like depression as an example. I would work with somebody who struggles with depression in a little bit of a different way because we would really get into what the soul is trying to speak to, what it's attempting to be heard. And it's manifesting as depressive symptoms, but really it's the soul's way of speaking and attempting to be heard.
I love that. And I did read a bit more from what you shared on your website. And what I really pulled from depth psychotherapy is that, I mean, I feel like all therapy is about turning inward, but specifically you focus on really getting to the root, and the root is the subconscious or the unconscious. And I feel like that's really hard work to tap into and to reprogram. And I'm just curious what your approach is in guiding people to turn inward so deeply so that they can understand what their subconscious is programmed with.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a lot of ways that we could get there. I think that through a depth oriented lens, I'm kind of always asking a couple things, right? So I'm always asking, what is attempting to be heard? Like, what is going on beneath the surface that wants us to hear it, right? But also, it's a way of looking at the collective as well as the individual. So a depth oriented approach really doesn't separate the two. We live in a collective, the collective lives within the individual. You cannot separate them, right? And so if we understand that, and at some unconscious level, Jung believed that what he called the collective unconscious, actually, all of our unconsciouses are connected, right? We're spiritual beings kind of in these physical bodies. And so it would not behoove somebody coming to me for me to look at them in a silo, right? It's better for them for me to say, what's going on for your soul that it feels like it's suffering in this way, within this larger context, right? Whether that's the family unit, whether that's the kind of larger collective societal unit, and starting to understand that. So there's that kind of component to it as well. Look, and I think depth, I mean, I work in a lot of other ways as well. So I bring in mindfulness work. I'm highly trained in Buddhist psychology and in yogic psychology and spiritual psychology. So a lot of us kind of weave together this web of what works for us, I think, as therapists or as clinicians. But I think having that training in depth more than anything just gives me these lenses to look through where I'm constantly saying, where's the collective in this? And what is it that the soul is really trying to express, right? I guess that would be the easiest way. It's interesting you're asking me these questions because I don't know that I've ever had to actually put them in like tangible words before. So thank you for challenging me.
Of course. And thank you for sharing. And what's coming up for me with that is that I love that you brought up not only observing the individual, but the collective, because I feel like it allows us some grace when we are in that journey inward and in our subconscious, and acknowledging that all of what's there isn't just ours, that some of it was adopted and programmed by our environment, by the collective, by the town that we live in, the schools that we went to, the groups of friends that we've had.
The myth of the culture that we live in, right? Like the United States is a very specific archetype and a very specific myth. And that impacts those of us who grew up here, right?
Yeah. And with that being said, something that's coming up for me now that I'm just really curious to ask you is, and I feel like this somewhat correlates to the expression of gratitude that you shared earlier. I feel like we've just been living in some really interesting times where a lot of healing and awakening has been taking place as individuals and as a collective. And I think a lot of the callings that we've had as individuals to heal has been a collective calling. I don't think it's a coincidence that so many of us are in this journey, and that health and wellness did become so much more quote unquote mainstream in the past few years. And I'm curious if you've had any observations of what's coming up in the collective for us at this time.
When you say what's coming up, do you mean around this idea of health and wellness?
Yes, like specifically, have you observed that there's anything in specific that the collective is feeling called to heal?
I think it's actually being called to heal a lot of things, right? But I think that what we're seeing is, this is a big one. So if I pull back and I look at the ability to have knowledge at our fingertips that we once were not able to have, right? So when you look at, for example, this is going way back, right? But when you look, for example, at how Western religion was spread just through word of mouth and through a very select few people who could read, because the rest of the people who could not read, right? And so they were able to kind of say whatever they wanted to say, write whatever they wanted to write, and make it like this is so, right? And nobody could question it. I think that partly by nature of where we're at technologically, That's not necessarily the case anymore. Now, are there still people at the top pulling strings and telling us what they want us to believe? Of course, right? But I think that because we've got the ability to poke around and ask questions and find things out that we weren't able to, I think a lot of us are starting to kind of, like wake up from the matrix, basically, question things that our parents' generation and our grandparents' generation didn't question, right? Like, why is it the way that it is? Why is our agricultural system as screwed up as it is? Why is the pharmaceutical companies, why do they have any control of the FDA, for example? It's like we're starting to just ask these questions. And it's really only a generation or two ago that people really weren't asking those questions. I mean, there was a maybe the hippie movement. But I think on this more mass scale, people are starting to really wake up and want to take that stuff into their own hands, right? We want to be responsible for our own healing. We want to be responsible for the collective healing. And knowledge, I think, is part of that. I also think that the world has gotten smaller through technology, right? And so when I look at, say, I'm not sure how old you are. My little sister's only, 23. So we'll say Gen Z, which is about the year 2000. And I look at how much more invested in the collective she is and has been her whole life than even my generation, right? Which I'm a millennial. You can also look at how she has seen what's gone on, and it's been in her face her entire life, right? So when I was little, I might have heard about apartheid. Potentially, if I overheard the news my mom was watching at 10, or if I happened to see it in a newspaper, or if my teachers talked about it in a real way, right? Not in kind of the way that they want us to hear about it. That's not the case for people who are growing up now. There's Syrian refugees in their face every time they open their phone. And so even in that, like, we've gotten a lot more attached to each other, connected to each other. I think on some level, maybe even unconscious for a lot of people, it's impossible now even for them to separate the individual from the collective. Whereas I think before, we were able to just put our heads down, stay in our bubble, and pretend like we were being taken care of by some kind of power that be, the powers that be. And I think we all know that that's not the case. I think we know that it's actually our responsibility to take care of ourselves and to kind of make that change. Changes, plural.
Yeah, that's such a insightful note regarding the difference in generations. And that makes me think about conversations I've had with friends when we talk about our healing with our parents, and how it's so important for us to acknowledge the fact that we as millennials, and especially Gen Z, as you're saying, have so much more access to information surrounding healing and health and wellness and tools to, expand our consciousness. And older generations didn't have as much of those resources to heal themselves and to learn about healing. So yeah, it's a whole conversation in and of itself to talk about how technology has impacted our healing journey. To touch on another note here, you have a quote on your website that I really love, and it's by, hopefully I'm pronouncing this right, Anais Nin. And the quote is, "When one is pretending, the entire body revolts." I'm curious as to why you have this one quote on your website, and I feel like, let me just start there.
Yeah, I mean, for somebody who also obviously, you have a podcast, you have to like really parse down what it is that you want to be on kind of that like public facing, platform. This quote always just really struck me because how do I talk about this? Whether we're looking at it through kind of more of a Buddhist psychology lens or a somatic lens or depth lens, it really doesn't matter, right? I mean, I think we all know at this point that everything is connected, right? Mind, body, spirit, it's all one. There's really no separation. And so often people come to me in my practice with some kind of vague complaint, right? Now that might be a mental complaint, it might be a physical complaint, but it's vague. It's like, I'm uncomfortable, or I'm unhappy in this and I don't know why. I feel like I should be doing something different than what I'm doing, but I don't know what that is. I'm really struggling physically. I have all these somatic symptoms, right? I've been really dealing with all these stomach issues. I've gone to all these doctors. And then we get into it and we discover, there's all these anxieties and all of these things. And so I think for me, that quote just so beautifully summarizes the fact that it's all connected, right? And that if we are not living in alignment with what our soul is attempting, again, to bring forward, right? Your entire being is going to revolt, right? When you look at, again, talking about the collective, when you look at the rise of anxiety and depression, right? I would argue from a depth psychological perspective that as a species, not just as a culture, as a species, most of us are living out of alignment, right? And so it would make sense that things like anxiety and depression are coming up in waves and in numbers like we've never seen before, right? People like to argue like, oh, it's social media. Okay, yes, and it's it's just this generation. Like they just like to label everything. Okay, yes, and right. I do believe that at the core of it really is, again, as a species, we're out of alignment. We're out of alignment with nature. We're out of alignment with spirit. We're out of alignment with self, with relationships. I would say most of our relationships are wildly codependent and out of alignment. Right. And so the body's revolting, all of our bodies, collective body.
Yeah. And when we talk about mind, body, spirit, interconnectedness, I feel like there's still people who are still trying to understand that. And the simplest way that I personally can put it, that just made it very clear for me that mind, body, and spirit are interconnected, is that if you focus on just healing your body, you'll notice how that impacts your mind and spirit. If you focus on just healing your mind, you'll notice how your body starts to feel better, your spirit starts to feel lighter. If you devote yourself to your spirit or your spirituality, a spiritual path, you'll notice how that begins to impact your mind and body.
Yes.
So that in and of itself just tells you like, okay, heal one thing, heal all things, harm one thing, harm all things.
Yes.
It's all interconnected.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to put it.
What I kind of want to dive into a little more in regards to this quote is the note of pretending. How do we know if we're pretending? Because again, I feel like a lot of this, like from what I'm coming to understand, if we truly, truly desire to heal ourselves in a very deep way, like we do have to get to the root, and we do have to get into our subconscious and what is unconscious. And sometimes we don't realize that we're pretending. Sometimes we don't realize that we are comfortable with self-sabotage or comfortable with toxic relationships. Because of course, when we think about it very passively, we're like, of course I'm not like actively trying to get in toxic relationships. Of course I'm not trying to harm myself in any way, shape, or form. But we don't realize that we actually are a part of inflicting our own suffering. We actually are pretending in some way. So how can we actually make note of that? And I think what this quote is suggesting is that, one way you can tell that you are pretending is your body revolting. Like if you do notice that there are symptoms of anxiety or depression, like getting curious and asking yourself, how may I have been pretending that things are okay when they're not?
Yeah. I mean, how am I contributing to my suffering? Right. I think that a lot of what I talk about in my work is radical responsibility. And, some people, I've definitely been told by people that it can come across as victim blaming. And I hear that. And I, again, would argue that we're always a participant in our healing, right? Whether that's active or not. And so I ask people regularly, like, how are you showing up as an active participant in your suffering, right? It is a empowering perspective shift when you start looking at things as happening for you instead of happening to you, right? And of course, I've heard this, the kind of more drastic examples of, so, if we're talking about rape, if we're talking about child abuse, so like you're telling me it's happening for me. And of course, no, there's obviously going to be a time where there's a victim and a perpetrator. It's not the specific instance that we're talking about. It's what you do with it after, right? So I know personally, I'm thinking of one person that comes up who was horribly abused in many ways by her father growing up. And she is one of the most prophetic healers and just magnificent humans I've ever met, and has really taken that experience and transmuted it through a lot of hard work into what she now puts out into the universe, right? And again, remember I said hard work. It doesn't come without a lot of work. Human beings suffer. Suffering is real. And so it's not to pretend that this stuff doesn't happen to us, or that we're not actually a victim at some point, but we get to decide what it is that we're going to do with the cards that we have been dealt, right? And that's the point that a lot of people will come to me, and I have to kind of say, I've been called a couple times the cold water in the face therapist, where a couple times I've said to somebody, I'm like, okay, well, but what's your part in this? What's your 100%, right? I would be remiss if I didn't kind of give some credit to the Al-Anon world that I went through. And how much help I think there's obviously hurt too, but how much help I think 12 steps can be for a lot of people. That is constantly asking you, what's your 100%? What can you own? How do you keep your side of the street clean? Right. And I think for a lot of us, I think as human animals, it's air quotes easier for us to point the finger at somebody else and say, but it's their fault and I'm the victim. Being the victim, being righteous, being angry, while it feels very empowering in the moment, it's the opposite, right? And so a lot of what I do is really kind of push my clients to take ownership, to take responsibility for how they're showing up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the hardest things to realize as a human in our journey is that ultimately, regardless of what happened to us or what has happened to us, like we at the end of the day are responsible for how it is that we're going to respond to what happens to us, and how it is that we're going to move forward. And I think it's so important that, yes, we acknowledge the moments where, if we want to say, we were the victim in something. And as you said, of course, there are experiences where you are the victim. And just validating our experiences and what we went through, but then taking our power back from that experience, and that looking like, okay, this is what I went through. I don't desire for this experience to overpower me in such a way to where it affects my relationship, my career, my relationship with myself, et cetera, et cetera. So what am I going to do about it moving forward? So yeah, just taking that accountability and, as you said, radical responsibility over our lives, and acknowledging that no one else is really going to do our healing for us. Like, we really do have to take the reins on that. But that said, something that I want to get into here next with you is how relationships can contribute so much to our healing. And I think there's an art to that. And I think that a lot of what you share on your platforms is really resourceful in regards to that. So yeah, let's talk about how relationships help us deepen our healing. Just to give a personal example, there was a time where I was telling myself that I didn't want to get into a romantic relationship until I was fully healed. Now, looking back at that, it feels very silly to say that, because I've just come to realize that there are certain things that we need to heal that I I believe that can only be healed in relationship with other people. And so when I realized that, then I really began to open myself up to deeper relationships. But now that I find myself, fast forward a bit, in gratefully what is the healthiest relationship, romantic partnership specifically, I've ever been in. Before coming into this partnership, I was like, I did so much healing. I'm ready to receive this. And now that I'm in this experience, I've found myself feeling like, oh my goodness, there's still so much more that I need to heal. And a lot of what I've learned is that if I really want to create a healthy, conscious relationship, it's going to require me to be completely open and honest and vulnerable in ways that perhaps I have never been. And that brings up a lot of stuff. So you've touched on a lot of this in what you've shared. One of the content pieces, you talk about how relationships are our biggest shame triggers. So I'd love for you to kind of dive into that a bit more as to what you mean by that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you articulated it beautifully. I mean, I think you're right. There's two things. So one, this idea of being healed is a farce. There's no such thing. Okay. I would argue that even some of our most prolific, oh my God, I can't talk right now. You guys, anybody listening, when you've got a toddler, the way that the English language just slips from your mind after not sleeping. We look at some of our prophets, right? I mean, I would say that even they were not quote unquote fully healed, because I don't think that that's the reality as a human being, right? We can look at this as a life school. And we can decide that the idea of healing is either going to be something that is overwhelming and, oh my God, there's so much and I have to heal this and I have to heal that, as if it's a very like checklist, matter of fact thing. Or we can say, I am here to learn. And my entire journey, my entire life is one in which I will continue to heal. Right. And we're an onion. I mean, there's just constantly going to be more layers. Now that can overwhelm me or that can excite me. It's really just how you choose to look at it, right? And you're right. There is some level of healing that we can only do in relationship to others. We're relational creatures, right? We are mirrored back to ourselves in the eyes of other people. And so I might think, oh yeah, I've got this whole attachment thing down. I'm functioning pretty secure now, right? And then I get into a romantic partnership with somebody who shows up, doesn't matter, a little avoidant, a little anxious, and boom, suddenly I've swung to the other side of the spectrum and I'm acting in ways that I didn't think I would either ever act in, or I thought, oh shit, I've already fixed that. I thought I already did that. The number of times, and listen, I've said it too in my own therapy, the number of times I've had a client say, but I've already done this. I've already worked this out. I've already gone through this. I already thought I fixed this part. And I'm like, well, maybe you fixed maybe you got to level 4 and now you're on level 5, it's like, there's always more to do. But again, I think that really has to do with just our perspective on it. Are you looking at it as like a task? Because to me, that also feels like a very kind of wounded masculine way of approaching healing. Healing is not linear. Life is not linear. The universe is not linear. It's not a checklist. It's not a task. It's not left to right, A to B, black to white. It's fluid and it's evolving and it's cyclical. And it comes in waves, right? And I think that's something to be excited about, not necessarily overwhelmed by or scared of. But this idea of people being our shame triggers, yeah, I mean, it's like what I said about people reflecting back to us ourselves, right? I think as human animals, our deepest wounding is around the not enough wound, right? Abandonment wounding. The absolute most basic human fear is what we would call annihilation anxiety. So this is the anxiety that I will be annihilated, that I will die, I will be snuffed out, right? Which makes sense. As beings, as animals, we want to survive. I mean, that's any species, right? That's like your sole purpose is to survive. And so anything that activates in us a feeling of abandonment as social creatures, that essentially is like we're signing kind of a death contract, right? Because as more social creatures, if you had been kind of excommunicated, it wasn't good, didn't look good for you, right? And so this not being enough, I would say, is actually inextricably linked to that same anxiety. And so when somebody brings up shame in us, shame to us is, okay, you don't approve of me, right? Which then says, I'm not enough or I am not worthy, which then links to, I might be abandoned, right? So they're all kind of working together in this like delicious, anxious soup that we have. And so shame really is just another opportunity for us to go into that soup and say, oh, okay, I've got an opportunity here to look at and potentially do some healing work around the not enough wound, the abandonment wound, right? I'm not a child anymore, right? I can't be quote unquote abandoned. I'm not going to die on the other side of this, on the other side of being judged or on somebody feeling like I'm not enough for them, right? So how do I stay with myself through those feelings of anxiety, not act out of my feelings of anxiety, which is where we see self-abandonment come into play, right? People pleasing, not setting boundaries, doing things that we don't want to do because we think it's what we need to do to not rock the boat, right? Or not speak up. We do those things in an attempt to not be abandoned. Right. And so if the real work of that is through, it's a process. You're not just going to like snap your fingers and do it right away, but it's building up this resilience around, I need to sit with myself and sit with those anxieties, not act on them so that I can get to the other side and I can really know I'm okay. I've got me. I'm still here. Right. And many times for us that doesn't really get activated until we're standing across from somebody else that we love and are vulnerable with.
Yeah, I feel like there is a lot of like that primal instinct within us that we almost have to help our bodies evolve from, like just affirming our safety and that we don't need to act out from fear of being abandoned, from fear of like this quote unquote death. Yeah. And something that you brought up in what you just shared is this notion of, our partner, whoever it is that we're in relationship with, not approving of us. But I think something that I've realized personally and have become increasingly curious about whenever feelings similar to that arise is me asking myself, is the person I'm in relationship with, where this is coming up, where I feel like they're not approving of me, is that actually a reflection of me not approving myself in some way? Like, is my partner, is my friend, is my brother actually expressing to me, showing me that they don't approve of me? Or have I just been triggered to think that because deep inside, I actually am not approving of myself because I feel like I should have it all together, I should be fully healed, or I should have not done X, Y, Z. And I feel like that also goes back to what you shared about the people that we're in relationship with and are surrounded by are mirroring back our own selves, our reflections of ourselves. I want to touch on that very briefly. Do you believe that those that we are surrounded by and are in relationship with, all of those people truly are reflections of us? Because I think sometimes, if we attract certain people who may be, I don't know, toxic in some way, and we may start to question ourselves like, oh, are they actually a reflection of me? We start to question ourselves, if we do fully believe in the notion that the people that we attract, the people that we're in relationship with are mirrors of us. Is there a limit to that? What kind of discernment should we have surrounding that?
Well, I think that let's first be specific that this has to do with chosen relationships, right? Because you're born into your family. I mean, sure, one could argue that your soul might choose that family as kind of a jumping off point or a catalyst, but we're talking chosen relationships here, right? And I would say that for most of us that have been on some kind of healing journey, if we step back and we kind of look at the trajectory of the relationships that we brought into our life, not just romantic, but friend, right? Or even work relationships like those who we decide to get close with. For many of us, I would say there's been a progression or there's been a change, right? Now, you might still have people in your life that you've had from when you were a kid. That's not what I'm saying. But I bet that any of us that have been on this journey for a significant amount of time have noticed a difference in the types of people that we bring into our sphere as we kind of continue to evolve and unpack the stuff and learn more about ourselves, right? And so, yes, I do believe that those chosen relationships are, in essence, a reflection back to you of how you see yourself, what you think you're worthy of, what you think your own kind of capacity is, right? What kind of level, let's say level in air quotes, of healing you're at, like how much of that work you've done. If I think, like, I'll give you a couple examples so we can kind of illustrate it. It's like so many times people will come to me, and I've heard this a bunch on social media too, like, I just keep dating narcissists, right? And so my question back to them, if we're talking radical responsibility, is, so why do you keep attracting narcissists, right? It's not about pointing at the narcissist. It's about pointing back at myself and saying there is something in me that is continuing to pull these people into my sphere. And until I do the work of understanding that, I'm going to continue to pull those types of people into my sphere, right? This is why we keep doing these patterns over and over again. So in essence, yes. I mean, I think if we really, again, pull back and look at who's around us, who we're surrounding ourselves with, it usually mirrors some kind of self-belief, self-doubt, or where we feel like we're at on this journey. And again, this idea of like, what is this here to teach me, or this being here for me versus it's happening to me, would argue that even in relationships, that question can be asked. What is this relationship here to teach me about myself? And it's not to say that in like a self-absorbed kind of way. I mean, human beings to an extent are all narcissistic, right? But it is to say there's an opportunity here for me to go another layer deeper, versus saying, oh, that person's toxic, that person's fucked up. Well, why am I drawn to that person that's toxic? That's where I would start.
Mm-hmm. That was very well expressed. Thank you for that clarity. And I think just the emphasis of chosen relationships is very important. Another aspect that you've touched on in regards to healing in relationships that I really loved that you brought up and talked about was the importance of showing up in our messiness in relationships. And how that is true vulnerability, and how that assists us in deepening our relationships and the intimacy in our relationships, is being so vulnerable to let the person we're in relationship with, and I think especially our partner in romantic relationships, letting that person see us in the mess of not having things figured out, and taking it a step further and opening ourselves up to receive the support and help in allowing them to help us figure it out. I would just love for you to expand a bit more on that, because I think, I mean, to be honest, like even myself, I've found myself in the current relationship that I'm in, romantic relationship, because I'm so self-aware, and because I may have perfectionist tendencies, I don't know. I found myself kind of secluding myself to figure certain things out so I can show up a bit more polished to my partner and being like, okay, I have it figured out now. I've sorted it all out in my mind. But I feel like when I do that, and I think sometimes it's good, to not just,
like dump on somebody.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which I'll ask you about after this. But I feel like if I continue to do that, then I am doing myself a disservice and the relationship a disservice and my partner a disservice because I'm not opening myself up to that vulnerability and to that intimacy. And every time that I have opened myself up, I've noticed how, as hard as it may have been, as maybe embarrassing as it may have felt in the moment, it ultimately deepened our relationship and brought us so much closer. And doing that consistently has just made me feel increasingly safer and has honestly assisted my healing in radically accepting myself. So yeah, I would just love for you to kind of expand on that, because I think it's really important for us to know that because we won't really be fully healed, it's inevitable that there will be moments that we will show up very messy in our partnerships, and that's okay.
I mean, not only is it okay, but it's imperative if your true goal or aim is to have intimacy, right? Yeah, I mean, I think the word that you used when you first started was this idea of allowing. And I think that's a really important word because, there's two there's like two branches of this healing practice. It's like the first branch, which is what I spoke to earlier around getting to the other side and knowing that I've got me, right, is really important. And also that deeper work that goes hand in hand with partnership or relationship, which is, can I allow you to see me in my messiness? And for many of us, and this kind of also ties into what we were just talking about bringing people into our sphere. For many of us, we will continue to perpetuate these kind of negative or limiting beliefs or narratives that we have about ourselves with the people that we bring into our lives, right? So if my deepest belief is that I am unlovable, I am, there's something wrong with me, I am not worthy, right? That worthiness wound, that in many ways I'm going to bring people into my sphere that are continue to prove that to me, right? By the way that they see me, by the way they act to me. And we do this because, the ego's sole purpose is survival and protection, right? That's what it's here for. It's here to protect us. That's the kind of purpose. And so the ego has a lot of beliefs and a lot of opinions, and it tends to be very unwavering, right? And so if my belief is that I am unlovable, that's an ego belief. The soul doesn't believe that you're unlovable. The ego believes you're unlovable, and the ego holds on to that belief in order to protect you from being hurt, right? So if I believe I'm unlovable, let me continue to bring people around me that are going to show me just how unlovable I am so I can stay in my guarded box and never risk leaving that box, right? And risk potential hurt. Once you start realizing how those people in your life are continuing to perpetuate those storylines, you may choose to start to play around with poking at it, right? Well, so what if what if my story is, and this is a story for a lot of us, especially women, I am only lovable if I am performing, being good, doing, being of service, right? Being quote unquote perfect. Many women, because that's kind of the narrative that we're taught in patriarchy, have that as a core belief, right? What if I take a risk and I'm messy and I'm not perfect and I'm not in service of, and I just show up as like the hot mess that I am? And what if they actually mirror back to me that makes them love me deeper, that makes them trust me more, that brings them closer to me, right? I'm almost taking away an opportunity for myself to get to that deeper level, to start to deprogram that thought, that feeling that I have around myself by not ever allowing it to potentially happen. Now, this is what we do as human beings. We're constantly looking out for, again, this is the ego. The ego protects us, right? And not just the ego. I mean, as human animals, I'm always scanning for danger. This is that negativity bias, right? But I'm missing out on such an opportunity for deepening if I'm only living from a place of survival and fear. That's fine. You can do that. A lot of us do, you can have a fine old life. That's great. But if you're really doing what you want, what you're saying you want to do, which is I'm attempting to have a conscious relationship and I'm attempting to utilize this partnership for deeper healing, then we've got to start seeing the ways in which our ego continues to perpetuate these like bullshit stories we have about ourselves and how we do or don't show up in that relationship.
Mm-hmm. This is such a good conversation. Thank you so much. To, touch on what I mentioned earlier, and what you pointed out is like, not dumping on our partner, whoever it is that we're in relationship with, and, experiencing our healing journey alongside. How do we heal in partnership, in relationship, heal together with someone in a healthy way?
That's a big question.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's no right or wrong. There's no one size fits all. It's going to be really based on, your two or more than two souls coming together, and what feels like healing to you, right? But part of that is being in dialogue about it. Part of that is being honest and open about it. And so we also come in with these ideas of like, this is what it's going to look like. And so many of us are so change averse that we hold on for dear life to the way we think it needs to look and be and feel, right? That we don't give a lot of room for humanity. We don't give a lot of room for the reality of who we are as beings. And so, meaning, this is what I think I need in order to heal this wound. And so I'm going to play around in that realm. I'm going to do this version of my healing. I'm going to show up this way into my partner. Maybe I even say to my partner, this is what I would need from you. This is what feels really helpful to me. And then I do that. And actually, it doesn't feel as good or as healing or as helpful as I thought it would. So rather than just saying, all right, time to pivot again. Let's see if this works and change it up and try this instead. We get into this like, oh, well, either that's not right. They're not right for me. Clearly I'm fucked up. Right. We get into this like black or white. I think a lot of this idea of healing in relationship to others, we've got to get better at just saying, again, this is a life school. There is no right way. You're not going to get an A, right? No one's on your deathbed they're not going to give you a report card that gives you an A for doing it right. So if I just look at it as it's a constant flowing opportunity for me to evolve, then I'm going to be a little better at like pivot, learn, pivot, learn, pivot, learn, and just do that in partnership with somebody else. Hey, that felt good before. It doesn't feel so good now. Let's try this, right? We have to like lose some of we get too sacred with it, I guess,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And what I got from that, one of the things I got from that is just the importance of open communication.
Mm-hmm.
So important.
Take them along for the ride,
Exactly. The last couple of things that I want to talk about here with you, before we get into the last question that I have. In your bio, you have recovering codependent. And in a lot of your work, you talk a lot about codependency. Why is this important to you?
I think it's just a viewpoint or a way that I have really started looking at all relational life. Talking about that kind of the collective and the individual being interchangeable or being rather inextricably linked, right? In so many ways, we are raised in this society to be codependent, right? And it shows up in all of our relationships. It's not just romantic relationships. Somebody doesn't have to be an alcoholic for somebody to be a codependent. It's a very that's like more of the antiquated way of looking at it. Really what this means is I'm only good if you're good. And then if you're not good, I'm not good. Right? So my ability to feel okay is based outside of myself. My sense of self, my sense of worth, my sense of goodness is based outside of myself. And that's essentially what we're taught relationships are. You complete me. You're my other half. I mean, especially for women, we are less than unless we're partnered, right? Our entire lives are supposed to stop in service of our children, because then our children become our whole lives, our whole world. My children are my everything, right? In a lot of cultures, this is how we're taught that we're supposed to look at, our elders and the way that we're supposed to care for our elders. Now, I'm not saying that we just completely chuck out this idea of caring for one another, right? Don't misunderstand me. And I hear that a lot. Oh, so what you're saying is, no, that's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is it's very dangerous if your sense of self is based outside of yourself. Because what are you left with, right? If my entire sense of worth is based in a romantic partnership, and then that romantic partnership disappears, who and what am I then? If my entire sense of self is based on my children, who am I once my children grow up and have their lives, their own lives, right? And we spend a lifetime doing this, putting our sense of self in other people. Right. And there's a lot of reasons why we do this. It's scary to look at ourselves. It seems like a lot of work to have to build a sense of self. It seems sometimes easier, actually, to put that in other people. I say recovering codependent for myself because, again, it's a lifelong process. I'm actively working to deprogram a lifetime, and by the way, generations worth of programming. I'm not going to get it right every time. I definitely do not. And I'm probably going to be working on it until the day I die. But it's something I'm really committed to. And it's something I'm really committed to people collectively starting to open their eyes to. It's actively in disservice to having vulnerable, intimate connections, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I love how you pointed out that it's not just a lifetime's worth, but this has been generations of conditioning and programming of this codependency. And I love how you clarified how it doesn't just show up in romantic partnership, but it shows up in many different aspects of our lives. And that's actually how, my most profound healing and awakening journey really began back in late 2020, was when I got out of what was yet another unhealthy relationship that just really took me by surprise how it turned out. And I was like, I've always known that I've had codependent tendencies. I really need to, and now I'm fully invested in addressing this because I know that it is playing a significant role in the kinds of partners that I'm attracting.
Yeah, I love that you said that. And I would say too, that again, people who really poo-poo this idea of actively working on codependency and how oh, you're just saying that we all should be these kind of siloed individuals. No, actually, I'm not. I think that we can have healthier relationships, more realistic, more honest, deeper connections with people when we are functioning from a state of interdependence and not from codependency. And I think actually by keeping ourselves in codependency, societally, globally, I think we're keeping ourselves in the matrix, to go back to what we were saying before. Because if there is an outside force that through generations and generations has taught me that my sense of self is based outside of myself. Now, by the way, that can be in other people, that can be in substances, that can be in shopping, that can be in social media, that can be in porn. It doesn't matter, right? Codependency is a behavioral addiction, and all addictions serve the same purpose, right? So if there is some kind of outside force that has taught me that that's where I find myself, what does that do? Keeps the status quo, right? It keeps a population of people from looking at themselves, from self-empowerment, from true spiritual connectedness, right? And it keeps people in this state of seeking, chasing, misery, anxiety, right? And so again, I would say, I'm glad you said that about that being kind of one of the catalysts for your biggest moment of awakening, because I think it can be for all of us, but it really does require some radical responsibility. And that is, for humans, one of the hardest things, right?
Yeah. And for those of you who are listening, I highly recommend you looking into what interdependence means, because the more that I've looked into that, the more that I've come to believe that interdependent relationships are where we're headed and
100%.
what we should strive for. Before we get into the final 5, which are just 5 quick fill in the blanks, the last question that I have for you is, when we're talking about healing in romantic partnerships, romantic relationships, what do you feel doesn't get talked about enough?
I mean, a lot of things. I think true disillusionment. I think a lot of people bitch. I think a lot of people stand around and they bitch about things in their lives. But bitching and complaining is not actually a form of connecting. It's not actually going to bring you to a deeper understanding. It's not actually a catalyst. And I think a lot of us get connected to each other in this way, like we bitch to each other, and that's like where we find comfort in these relationships. I've recently started being much more aware of how often women who are partnered with men will stand around and bitch about men. They're useless and how stupid they are and useless they are, all of these things, right? I mean, we see it in social media as well. And I've actively started taking myself out of those conversations because that's not helpful, right? And going back to this idea of personal responsibility, if you truly think your partner is that useless and that stupid, why are you with him? Because that's on you, not on him. And I don't want to be involved in these conversations anymore. It's more like, what are we going to do about it? Right. And if we're not really ready to do something about it, then bitching isn't going to solve the issue. Now, all that to say, to go back to the original question, I feel like real, true verbalization of the pain points in our relationships actually don't get talked about enough. Right. I'm a mother of I'm a fairly new mother. She's 3.5. And there's a lot of bitching and joking about how hard it is, but there's not a lot of real depth to some of these conversations. Like, but why is it so hard? What is keeping it this difficult? Why are relationships this hard? Right. Like, I want to get to the meat and potatoes of it. And the bitching to me just kind of feels like the surface stuff. And so I just think we would all benefit from just getting deeper, right? Having deeper, more honest conversations about the struggles that we're having, because a lot of times we won't say anything at all because we don't want to be a burden. Well, I guarantee you, if you were honest and real about it, 3 people standing around you would feel connected to that. And you would provide them a real opportunity for healing when they're like, oh my God, I'm not alone. Right. This is why group work is so profound. And it's what I mostly do now. Because there's just so much healing in seeing your story and somebody else reflected back.
Yeah. The question that you expressed there of like, what are we going to do about it? I feel like that's ultimately where it's at, right? Just us asking ourselves like, okay, well, what am I going to do about it? At the end of the day, what am I going to do about it? And yes, it's going to be really hard.
Sure.
Whatever the thing is that will lead you to what you ultimately desire and need. But if we look at it like, well, the experiences I've been having that I don't like and that I don't ultimately deserve are hard. And the healing to get to what I need and deserve and desire is going to be hard too. It's like, okay, well,
pick
which part do you want? Yeah. Yeah. Well, Vanessa, before we get into the final 5, I just want to hold space for you in the case that there's anything you feel called to express. If not, it's totally okay, but just want to hold that space for you.
Thank you, Jocelyn. No, I think this was a great conversation. I really appreciate you having me on.
Beautiful. Okay, so final 5 are just 5 fill in the blanks. It could be more than one word or just one word, whatever first comes to your mind.
Okay.
Okay. I'm grateful to heal.
Intergenerational trauma.
I'm grateful to understand.
The ways in which patriarchy has kept all of us wounded and small.
I'm grateful to learn
more about myself every day.
I'm grateful to receive.
The reflection back of my goodness, even though it's hard to hear.
And I'm grateful to give
perspective and strength to people I think that sometimes can't access it on their own for whatever reason.
Well, I am grateful for your giving of that as well. And everyone listening to this, highly, highly recommend you looking more into Vanessa's work and platforms. Head on over to the show notes, the description below. I'll have all the links there for you to explore more of Vanessa's work. Vanessa, thank you again so much for your time and energy and all the ways in which you've invested in your own self to then give back to others. It doesn't go unnoticed.
Thank you for your work. You're doing amazing things out there, and just bringing together these conversations is, like I was saying, people seeing themselves in other people is one of the biggest kind of game changers. So thank you for doing that.
Absolutely.